Fort Smith, Arkansas, 1879. Midnight. A group of hooded riders circles the federal courthouse, their torches casting shadows across the stone walls. They leave a message nailed to the door. A death threat. Anyone who testifies against white men in this court will be buried before sunrise. The message is signed with 3 letters that have terrorized the South for over a decade. KKK. They believe they own the night. They believe no one can touch them. But they have made one fatal miscalculation. Because riding toward them through the darkness of Indian Territory is a man they have never encountered. A man who was born into slavery and escaped to freedom. A man who has arrested over 3,000 outlaws and never lost a single prisoner. A man whose name will become the most feared word in any outlaw's vocabulary. Bass Reeves. What happens over the next 6 weeks will be systematically erased from American history for over a century. Because when Bass Reeves finished hunting these men, the Ku Klux Klan didn't just lose members. They lost their entire mythology of invincibility. And white America couldn't let that story survive. Let me take you back to understand how we got here. The year is 1875. The American frontier is bleeding. Indian Territory, what we now call eastern Oklahoma, has become the most dangerous region in the United States. Every outlaw, fugitive, and murderer east of the Mississippi has figured out the same thing. If you cross into Indian Territory, you disappear. Local law enforcement has no jurisdiction. State authorities can't follow you. For years, criminals have used this legal loophole to escape justice entirely. But something changes in 1875. A new judge arrives in Fort Smith, Arkansas. His name is Isaac C. Parker, and he inherits a court so corrupt, so broken, that most people consider it a joke. The previous court had become a haven for bribes and backroom deals. Outlaws would get arrested, pay off a deputy, and walk free the same day. Justice in the Western District of Arkansas means nothing. Parker looks at this chaos and makes a decision that will define his legacy. He will transform Fort Smith into the most feared courthouse in America. Within his first year, he sentences 6 men to hang on the same day. The message is clear. The era of lawlessness is over. But here's the part they don't teach in school. Parker understands something that most white judges of his era refuse to accept. To clean up Indian Territory, he needs deputies who can actually track and capture outlaws across 200,000 square kilometers of wilderness. He needs men who know the land, who can survive in conditions that would kill most people, who won't be intimidated by threats or bribes. And in 1875, the best man for this job happens to be black. Think about what this meant. Just 10 years after the end of slavery, a federal judge is hiring a black man to arrest white criminals and bring them to justice. In the heart of the former Confederacy, in a region still crawling with Ku Klux Klan sympathizers, Parker doesn't care about the controversy. He cares about results. And Bass Reeves delivers results like no one else in American law enforcement history. Reeves was born into slavery in 1838 in Arkansas. His enslaver brought him to Texas, where Reeves worked as a personal servant and became an expert marksman. When the Civil War erupted, everything changed. Some accounts say Reeves escaped after a violent confrontation with his enslaver. Others say he fled during the chaos of war. Either way, he ended up in Indian Territory, living among the Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole nations. For years, he learned their languages, studied their lands, and developed the survival skills that would make him legendary. When freedom came, Reeves had something almost no other lawman possessed. He knew Indian Territory like his own heartbeat. He could track a man across hundreds of kilometers of wilderness. He could speak multiple native languages. He understood the terrain, the hiding spots, the escape routes. And most importantly, he was absolutely fearless. Here's a question for you. How do you arrest someone who knows you're coming? Most deputies of that era would ride in with a posse, announce their presence, and hoped the outlaw surrendered. Reeves had a different approach. He became a master of disguise. He would dress as a farmer, a preacher, a drifter, even an outlaw himself. He would walk into criminal hideouts, completely unarmed in appearance, gain their trust, and then reveal the badge hidden in his pocket. By the time outlaws realized who they were dealing with, they were already in chains. In one famous case, Reeves tracked two brothers wanted for murder. He disguised himself as a tramp and walked 28 miles to their mother's house. He convinced her he was a fellow outlaw on the run, and she invited him to stay. When the brothers arrived, they found Reeves waiting with his pistol drawn. He arrested both men and walked them back to Fort Smith. This wasn't luck. This was genius-level tactical thinking. Now imagine you're a Ku Klux Klan member in 1879. You've spent years terrorizing black communities with impunity. You've burned houses, lynched freedmen, intimidated voters. You believe with absolute certainty that black people exist to be your victims. And then you hear about Bass Reeves, a black man with a federal badge, a black man who arrests white criminals, a black man who drags white outlaws in chains back to a courthouse where a white judge sentences them to hang. Everything you believe about racial hierarchy is being demolished by this single individual, and you cannot stand it. The Klan's strategy had always been simple. Terror works because victims are defenseless. Ride at night, wear hoods, attack in groups, disappear before anyone can respond. This formula had worked across the South for over a decade. But Fort Smith, under Judge Parker, represented something new. A federal court had actually prosecuted white supremacist violence. A court that treated crimes against black citizens as real crimes. A court protected by deputies who couldn't be bribed or intimidated. The Klan decided this court had to be destroyed. Subscribe if you're enjoying the video. The intimidation campaign began quietly. Witnesses scheduled to testify in cases involving white defendants started receiving anonymous letters. The messages were crude but effective. Testify and die. Your family will burn. We know where you live. Some witnesses disappeared before trial. Others recanted their testimony at the last moment, their eyes wide with terror. Jurors reported finding nooses left on their doorsteps. A clerk discovered his barn had been burned to the ground overnight. The message was spreading. The Klan wanted everyone connected to Parker's court to understand that federal law meant nothing in their territory. But then they made their critical error. They got bold. One night in late 1879, a group of hooded riders circled the courthouse itself. They rode in formation, torches blazing, in a deliberate display of power. They wanted Judge Parker to see them. They wanted everyone in Fort Smith to understand that the Klan could reach anywhere, even the steps of federal justice. They nailed their threats to the courthouse door and rode off into the darkness, convinced they had struck fear into the heart of the government. They had no idea what they had just triggered. When Judge Parker read the threats the next morning, he didn't flinch. He didn't call for military protection. He didn't negotiate or compromise. Instead, he did something that would seal the fate of every man who had participated in that ride. He issued federal arrest warrants. The charges were severe: conspiracy against the United States, intimidation of witnesses and officers of the court, obstruction of federal justice. These weren't minor offenses. Under the laws of that era, these charges carried the possibility of execution. And then Parker made the call that changed everything. He summoned Bass Reeves. Think about this moment. A white federal judge is handing a black deputy marshal the authority to hunt down and arrest Ku Klux Klan members. He's giving Reeves complete jurisdiction to pursue these men wherever they hide. He's backing a black lawman with the full power of the United States government against white supremacist terrorists. In 1879, 12 years before the Jim Crow era would make such scenarios impossible, Reeves accepted the warrants without hesitation. He knew exactly what he was riding into. The Klan had murdered black lawmen before. They had ambushed deputies, poisoned their horses, set traps along no routes. Riding against the Klan wasn't just dangerous. It was potentially suicidal. But Reeves had faced death more times than he could count. And unlike the hooded cowards who attacked at night, he didn't need darkness to do his job. What follows is one of the most remarkable manhunts in American frontier history. Reeves didn't ride out with a massive posse that would alert every Klan sympathizer for miles. He moved quietly, often alone or with just one or two trusted companions. He used his network of informants, people he had cultivated over years of working in Indian Territory, former outlaws who owed him favors, Native American trackers who respected his skills, even some white settlers who despised the Klan's violence and were willing to share information secretly. Here's something most people don't understand about the Klan of this era. They weren't a tightly organized army. They were local cells, groups of men who knew each other from their communities, who met in secret, who relied on their neighbors to protect their identities. This structure made them feel invincible. How could anyone identify them when their own towns shielded them? But it also made them vulnerable, because if you could find one member, you could find them all. And Reeves was about to prove exactly that. His first target was a farmer living about 40 miles from Fort Smith. This man had been identified as one of the riders, someone who had been seen near the courthouse that night by a witness brave enough to come forward. Reeves approached the farm in disguise, posing as a cattle buyer looking for livestock. He spent an entire day on the property, asking innocent questions, studying the layout, identifying escape routes. The farmer suspected nothing. That night, Reeves returned. He caught the man completely by surprise, asleep in his own bed. Before the farmer could reach for the rifle mounted above his headboard, Reeves had him in irons. The arrest took less than 60 seconds. No shots fired. No chase through the wilderness. Just precise professional law enforcement, executed by a man who had perfected his craft over years of relentless practice. But Reeves wasn't finished. He knew this man was just one piece of a larger network, and he needed information. What happened next demonstrates why Reeves was so effective. He didn't threaten or brutalize his prisoner. He simply explained the situation with cold clarity. Judge Parker had issued warrants. Federal charges meant federal prison or federal gallows. The only way to reduce a sentence was to cooperate. And cooperation meant names. It meant locations. It meant everything. The farmer talked. He gave up every member of his Klan cell. He described their meeting places, their signals, their plans. He revealed that the courthouse intimidation was supposed to be just the beginning. The Klan had planned a campaign of escalating violence designed to shut down Parker's court entirely. They intended to assassinate witnesses, attack deputies, and eventually target the judge himself. Reeves now had a map of the entire conspiracy. Over the following weeks, he systematically dismantled it. Let me give you some numbers that show the scale of what Reeves accomplished. Between late 1879 and early 1880, he personally arrested over 20 men connected to the courthouse intimidation. He captured them across 3 different territories, traveling hundreds of miles through some of the most dangerous terrain in America. Not a single one escaped. Not a single one was killed during arrest. Every man was brought back to Fort Smith alive to face trial. This wasn't vigilante justice. This was federal law enforcement at its most effective. And here's where the story becomes truly devastating for the Klan. These weren't anonymous figures being arrested. These were known men from their communities. Farmers, merchants, even a few local officials. When Bass Reeves brought them into Fort Smith in chains, their neighbors saw. Their families saw. The entire region saw that the Klan's supposed power meant nothing when a black deputy marshal came calling. The trials that followed were the final humiliation. Judge Parker presided with his characteristic severity. He allowed no delays, no procedural tricks, no intimidation of witnesses. With the accused Klansmen now in custody, the witnesses who had been terrorized found their courage. They testified in detail about the threats, the violence, the campaign to undermine federal justice. Here's another question for you. Have you ever wondered why the Klan wore hoods? It wasn't just about fear. It was about deniability. If no one could identify you, you couldn't be prosecuted. You could terrorize an entire community and then return to normal life the next morning, immune from consequences. But Reeves had stripped away that immunity. He had identified them. He had arrested them. He had brought them into a courtroom where their faces were displayed for all to see. The verdicts came down like hammer blows. Guilty, guilty, guilty. Parker sentenced the ringleaders to hang. Others received lengthy prison terms. A few who had cooperated early received reduced sentences, which actually made the situation worse for the Klan, because those reduced sentences meant more testimony, more names, more arrests. The network of intimidation collapsed entirely. The hangings took place on the famous Fort Smith gallows, where Parker had executed dozens of criminals since taking the bench. The men who had ridden to terrorize a federal courthouse now stood with nooses around their necks, their final moments witnessed by crowds that included the very black citizens they had sought to intimidate. There is a brutal poetry in that image. The terrorists who believed they were above the law, brought to absolute justice by the man they considered beneath them. But here's the part that makes this story even more remarkable. Reeves didn't stop. He continued serving as a deputy marshal for over 3 decades. He arrested more than 3,000 fugitives over his career, a record that has never been matched. He was shot at, ambushed, and targeted by assassins more times than anyone could count. And he survived it all, dying of natural causes in 1910 at the age of 71. Do you know what his final years looked like? This is where the story becomes painful. After Oklahoma became a state in 1907, the new government refused to allow black men to serve as law enforcement officers. Reeves, the greatest deputy marshal in American history, was forced to become a city police officer in Muskogee, walking a beat at the age of 69. The same state he had protected for decades now told him he wasn't qualified to wear a badge. White supremacy had caught up with him at last, just not in the way the Klan had intended. And then came the erasure. For over a century, Bass Reeves was virtually unknown outside of Oklahoma. History books mentioned Judge Parker. They discussed the frontier era. They told stories of white lawmen like Wyatt Earp and Wild Bill Hickok, men whose accomplishments pale compared to Reeves. But the black deputy who arrested more criminals than any of them, who defeated the Klan with warrants and tracking skills and sheer courage, simply vanished from the national narrative. Why? Ask yourself that question. Why was the story of Wyatt Earp, who served as a lawman for a fraction of the time and arrested a fraction of the criminals, turned into movies and television shows and legendary status, while Bass Reeves was forgotten? The answer is obvious when you think about it. A black man who represented federal law, who arrested white terrorists, who proved that black Americans could protect justice rather than merely receive it. That story couldn't be allowed to survive. It contradicted everything white supremacy needed people to believe. Here's what they never told you. The revelation that changes everything about how we understand frontier justice. The image of the lone white sheriff bringing order to the Wild West is largely mythology. In reality, some of the most effective lawmen of that era were black, Native American, and mixed-race deputies who understood the territory in ways white lawmen never could. Bass Reeves wasn't an exception. He was the best example of a larger truth that got buried under a century of racist historiography. And the Klan? The original Ku Klux Klan that had terrorized the South during Reconstruction was already dying by 1879. Federal prosecution under the Ku Klux Klan Act had scattered their leadership. But the remnants, the night riders who continued operating in frontier territories, believed they could outlast federal attention. They believed that eventually the government would give up, that white solidarity would protect them, that black deputies like Reeves were temporary aberrations. Bass Reeves proved them wrong. Every arrest he made, every Klansman he brought to justice, every conviction that followed, demonstrated that organized white supremacist violence could be defeated by determined, competent law enforcement backed by judicial will. The Klan didn't collapse in Indian Territory because of changing attitudes or social progress. They collapsed because a black man hunted them down and put them in chains. The second Ku Klux Klan, the one that emerged in 1915 and grew to millions of members, only succeeded because the lessons of the 1870s and 1880s had been forgotten. They succeeded because men like Bass Reeves had been erased from history. They succeeded because white America had systematically dismantled the structures that had allowed black law enforcement to flourish during Reconstruction and its immediate aftermath. There's something else you need to understand about what Reeves represented. He wasn't just a lawman. He was a symbol of what was possible when black Americans had access to legitimate power and institutional support. Judge Parker backed him. The federal government authorized him. He had the legal tools to do his job. And with those tools, he became arguably the most effective law enforcement officer in American frontier history. Now compare that to what happened after Reconstruction ended. Black lawmen were pushed out. Black political power was destroyed. Black communities were stripped of legal protection and left vulnerable to the very terrorists Reeves had spent his career fighting. The success of Jim Crow violence depended on ensuring that no future Bass Reeves could ever emerge. Every lynching in the decades that followed happened in part because the structures that supported Reeves had been deliberately destroyed. Every race riot, every burning of Black Wall Street, every act of white supremacist terror succeeded because black communities no longer had men with badges and federal backing to defend them. Remember this the next time someone tells you that progress happens slowly, that change takes generations, that we have to be patient. In 1879, a black man was arresting Klan members and bringing them to execution. By 1910, that same man was barely allowed to walk a beat. Progress doesn't move slowly. It gets reversed, deliberately, systematically, by people who benefit from that reversal. The story of Bass Reeves in the Fort Smith intimidation case isn't just history. It's a blueprint. It shows what happens when black Americans have institutional power, legal authority, and the backing of the justice system. They don't just survive white supremacist violence. They defeat it, they arrest it, they bring it to trial and watch it hang from the gallows. That's why this story was buried. That's why you've probably never heard of Bass Reeves until recently. That's why the mythology of the Wild West features white heroes and ignores the black deputies who actually kept the peace. Subscribe if you liked the video. So remember Fort Smith, 1879. Remember the Klan riding to intimidate a federal courthouse. Remember Judge Parker issuing warrants without hesitation. Remember Bass Reeves riding into the darkness, alone and determined, hunting the hunters. Remember 20 Klansmen brought back in chains. Remember the trials, the verdicts, the gallows. Remember that the KKK tried to intimidate a federal court, and Bass Reeves turned it into a death sentence. Their names were erased from history books. Their methods were attributed to white lawmen who came later. Their victories were buried under myths about black helplessness and white supremacist power. But what happened in Fort Smith was real. The arrests were real. The convictions were real. The executions were real. And the message is as relevant today as it was in 1879. When black Americans have power, organization, and institutional backing, they don't need to beg for justice. They enforce it. That's the lesson. That's the truth. And that's the history they never wanted you to know.